Hello, welcome to the Implementing CDBG webinar series presented by the New Hampshire Community Development Finance Authority. My name is Kathleen Weissenberger, and the topic for today's module is Eligible Activities. You can download a copy of today's PowerPoint slides from the webinar on the CDFA website for future reference. Let's get started. The eligible activities in the State and Small Cities CDBG program are actually not found in the federal regulations. The state program uses the statutory authority of the HCDA, but many states choose to use the entitlement regulations as a safe harbor when determining the eligibility of an activity. We're going to be going through all of the eligible activities from the HCDA and giving examples of each one. The first eligible activity is acquisition of real property. This can be the normal purchase of property. It can be a long-term lease, which HUD determined that standard to be 15 years for the entitlement program. Many states have adopted 15 years or more for a permanent acquisition under a long-term lease. Property can be donated, and there are some other things that we'll talk about. The key is that the grantee or the subrecipient must obtain a permanent interest in the property. You can acquire land, you can acquire buildings, you can acquire easements, which are quite common in the CDBG program, both permanent and temporary easements. You can also acquire things like water rights and air rights. However, those are not things that are commonly purchased in the CDBG program due to the nature and uses of our CDBG funds. Some examples would be purchasing land for a community center, purchasing a building to turn it into a senior center, buying a residential house or property to provide rental housing for affordable LMI homeowners, and acquiring deteriorated buildings for demolition. Some things that really need to be considered when you're talking about using CDBG money for acquisition of property. The first is that acquisition is the only activity that has a future use requirement. What that means is that when you use CDBG money to acquire property, the future use of that property must meet a national objective. So you can't acquire property with CDBG funds for land banking or for future use. You must meet a national objective with the property when you buy it. The other thing to keep in mind is change of use, which is applicable to all CDBG investments. Once you have closed out a project, within 5 years of closeout of that project, if you change the use of that property, you have to change it to another CDBG eligible use, or the grantee will have to pay the funds back to CDFA. The other thing to keep in mind is that because you're using CDBG, which are federal funds, all acquisition is covered by the Uniform Relocation Act. The next activity, which is the most commonly used activity in the CDBG program, is public facilities improvements and privately owned utilities. This is basically your construction, rehab, and acquisition for public improvements like sidewalks, storm drainage, wastewater, drinking water, and facilities like community centers and other. Here's a list of examples of public facilities and a list of public improvements. Keep in mind that this is the same eligible activity, even though when you're working on a grant application, you might be doing multiple things and be asked to line item your budget and separate streets or sidewalks with your buildings for community centers or senior centers. When you're doing privately owned utilities, which are a eligible activity in the CDBG program, they must be publicly regulated utilities, and the activities must be serving a low to moderate income area. So you still have to meet the national objective, and the utility must be one that's publicly regulated in order to use CDBG funds. But that means that you could have a private utility electric company or water company and do projects that are on their privately owned equipment or property, as long as the service is provided to a low to moderate income group of people. Some other things that are important to consider with public facilities and improvements. There's something called title in the federal regulations. When you're doing a public facility, the public facility must have what's called title, which basically means it must be open to the public. They must have some open hours where anyone from the general public can utilize the facility or the improvement. Water and sewer hookups are another really key thing to understand, that when you're talking about the lateral connection between a private property or a home and the main, whether it's the water or sewer, those are actually considered housing rehab and are not done under the eligible activity of public improvement. Water and sewer hookups are a direct housing rehab activity and must be 100% LMI. One of the other things that's actually quite common in the CDBG program is funding a facility that is both eligible and ineligible. There are a lot of communities around the country, or rural communities, that have fire stations with a town hall attached to them, or a community center with the police department connected. You may do a facility with both eligible and ineligible uses, as long as you can clearly define and prorate the costs of the building or the rehab to the eligible portion of the building and the ineligible portion of the building. Another thing with public facilities and improvements is fees. You have to make sure that the fees that you are utilizing in, say, a community center for rental of the hall or rental of some basketball equipment, that the fees that you are requiring are something that a low to moderate income person would be able to afford. Because again, low to moderate income benefit is the primary objective of CDBG, and we have to make sure that those low to moderate income people in the community have the accessibility to the facility that was funded with CDBG. You can do special assessments, but there's specific guidance in the regulations when and how you do a special assessment for a CDBG funded public improvement project. If you are considering a special assessment, please contact CDFA, because they are complicated, and sometimes you'll find it's easier to just pay for the project with CDBG and not collect a special assessment. The other thing that we won't go into great detail on is 911 systems. There's great detail in the federal regulations about how and when you can utilize CDBG to fund a 911 system. Again, contact CDFA if you have questions about that eligible activity. What's not eligible under public facilities and improvements are buildings for the general conduct of government. We talked about public facilities and public improvements, and I mentioned the town hall as the ineligible portion of an eligible project. If a building or a portion of a building is for the general conduct of government, it is specifically ineligible for CDBG. However, that does not mean that you cannot do the removal of architectural barriers, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Operation and maintenance costs are also specifically ineligible under public facilities and improvements. You can fund the construction or the rehabilitation of, say, a drinking water plant and distribution lines, but you cannot use CDBG to fund the ongoing maintenance or the operator salary for that particular utility. When we talk about public services, operation and maintenance are clearly a part of that activity. It's important to understand that operating and maintenance costs are ineligible when it comes to public facilities and public improvements. It's also ineligible to purchase construction equipment. You cannot buy construction equipment to do a project with CDBG funds and then keep construction equipment. It's as simple as that. New construction of housing is also specifically ineligible in the CDBG program, not just public housing, but it falls under this category of public housing because we're talking about public facilities. You can rehab an old school and turn it into public housing, but you cannot do new construction of public housing under public facilities and improvements. The next activity is code enforcement. This is not a commonly used activity, but it is done in some communities as part of a revitalization project. Code enforcement is specifically for the inspections and salaries of a code enforcement program that is targeting an area that is considered blighted and in need of redevelopment. Code enforcement as an eligible activity does not include the cost of actually correcting the violations, and it should be done in conjunction with some other form of investment, whether that's CDBG or other funding source. The code enforcement as an eligible activity needs to be done in conjunction with other investment in that particular target area. Clearance, rehabilitation, reconstruction, and construction of buildings is the other large activity with CDBG funds. We find many of our CDBG programs in the State and Small Cities program come out of this eligible activity. Clearance, demolition, removal, reconstruction, rehabilitation of buildings and improvements are all part of this. So we'll try to break it down a little bit. Some of the things that you can do under this particular category are demolition of buildings or improvements, removal of demolition debris, removal or treatment of environmental contaminants, so remediating a brownfield, and movement of structures. This can be done on residential property, including manufactured housing. It can be done on commercial or industrial property, although when you do this particular activity with commercial or industrial property, you are limited to the exterior of the buildings and you're limited to code violations only. Some other examples would be nonprofit properties, non-residential buildings that are not considered a public facility or improvement. The most common use of this is residential, owner-occupied rehab, rental rehab, and rehabilitation or conversion of buildings into affordable housing. Some of the things that this category does not include: secondary housing units. What that means is you cannot provide rehab or homeowner assistance or anything with somebody on their secondary housing unit. It has to be their primary place of residence to do rehabilitation on a property. Luxury items are not included, so pools would not be something that you could use your CDBG funding for. Equipment, furnishings, other personal property, anything that's not actually part of the structure. The example that I like to give for this is when you're funding a food pantry or a food bank, you're often part of the construction of the building or the rehabilitation of the building into a food pantry includes extremely large walk-in freezers and refrigerators. Those are considered an integral part of a food bank. However, if you're doing owner-occupied rehab and you are providing a refrigerator or a window air conditioner, those things are considered furnishings or personal property. They are not part of the property itself. They're not integral to the structure. The other thing that you cannot include, unlike Habitat homeowner sweat equity, is not something that can be reimbursed with CDBG. And the main reason for that is sweat equity and it can't be paid for with CDBG. Now, there are some other things to keep in mind about this particular eligible activity: reconstruction and substantial rehabilitation. We're going to talk about the new construction restriction with CDBG funds. And I mentioned that you can't do new construction of public housing when you're talking about public facilities. When you're talking about clearance, rehabilitation, reconstruction, and construction of buildings, you are not allowed to do new construction of housing. But occasionally, a house or a single family home will be so far gone that it is not financially feasible to be rehabilitated. Reconstruction or substantial rehabilitation essentially means tearing the building down and building it back up from scratch. That is not considered new housing and is allowable as long as you're doing it on the same site and in a substantially the same manner. Essentially, if you are deviating from the original design, if it was a 4-studio apartment building, you can only build a 4-studio unit apartment building. If it was a 3-bedroom house, you build a 3-bedroom house. There are a few allowable changes due to safety for the design, and you may or may not be able to get a waiver from HUD on the number of rooms if there are size issues under current code, but you would need to talk to CDFA before you went down that road, because the bottom line is you build a property, a house on the same spot, in the same footprint, with the same number of rooms that were there before. The other exceptions to new construction of housing is as last resort. And last resort housing means you have converted or demolished affordable rent or occupiable housing, and you must replace that under CDBG requirements. Community-based development organizations are also allowed to do new construction of housing. Currently, New Hampshire does not have any qualified CBDOs, community-based development organizations. However, if and when there should be any certified in New Hampshire, they are allowed to do new construction of housing. The other thing you can do is in support of activities. In support of activities are things like acquisition, remediation of a site, putting in roads and sidewalks and water and sewer for maybe home funds or tax credit funds to come in and do new construction of housing. Your activities would actually be infrastructure in support of housing and not the new construction of housing. So we've already talked about some of these examples: demolishing abandoned structures, rehabilitation of a single family home, and converting an old school into housing. The next eligible activity is architectural barrier removal. This is an activity that is specifically directed to removing material and architectural barriers that restrict the mobility of seniors and handicapped persons. We're talking about elderly, 62 and older, and severely disabled adults under the definition with the Census Bureau. Those activities can be done on any building, including buildings for the general conduct of government, as long as the activity is restricted to only removing a barrier. The most important thing to understand about this eligible activity, architectural barrier removal, is that there must be a barrier for you to remove in order to do this. It is not ADA compliance. And a lot of people get confused on that. You cannot use CDBG money to build a new facility, say a senior center, and say we're only going to use the CDBG funds on the ADA portion of the building, and therefore that's the activity that we're doing. Or we are going to build a new town hall, and the only thing that we want CDBG for is the ADA compliance. That is not the removal of architectural barriers. There must be something there that is making it inaccessible to the elderly and severely disabled adults. If you have a county courthouse that has necessary social services on the second floor, you only have stairs and no elevator. An elevator would be removing the barrier of the stairs. If you have a park that does not have any bathroom, and you want to put in an ADA accessible bathroom and a concrete paved path to the bathroom, that is not the removal of architectural barriers. If there's a bathroom there, but it's not ADA compliant, then you can replace or rehab the bathroom, but you can't build a bathroom that wasn't there. And I'm hoping that example clears that up for you. There must be something there that needs to be made accessible in order to use this category. The next category of eligible activity is loss of rental income. This is very rarely used, and it's very rarely used even more so in the state program. Loss of rental income is only used when you are running a housing program and you have property owners that you are asking to hold specific units available because maybe you have a lack of 3-bedroom apartments in your community, but you know that you're going to be temporarily displacing a 3-bedroom house family, and you need to hold that unit open because you don't have the luxury of finding them another 3-bedroom unit. You essentially can pay the landlord for the 1 or 2 or 3 months, however long it is, to hold that unit available until you're actually ready to move them in. If this is something that you think you might be doing, this is one of those that can be very tricky, and you should contact CDFA to talk it through with them first. Disposition of real property is exactly what it means. The only time you use this eligible activity is if you have property that was acquired with CDBG, and for some reason it is no longer being operated under the eligible activity and national objective, and it is being sold. The costs of that disposition would go under this eligible activity. This is one of those areas that you may have other eligible costs associated as part of a larger project, and CDFA will ask you to itemize these activities. Public services. Public services, I mentioned earlier about the costs of operation and maintenance. Public services are things that are being provided by the municipality, quite frequently through a nonprofit organization. If they have not been paid for by the municipality during the preceding 12 months, then you may use CDBG money. This will pay for the cost of providing the service, rent on the space, materials associated, essentially anything that's associated with the provision of the service that is being offered to the public can be included under this category. It is important to understand that it has to be a new service or a quantifiable increase in the service that's already been provided. You cannot supplant municipality or local government funds with CDBG. Some of the examples of public services are childcare, healthcare, job training. You can see the list on the slide, homeless service, drug abuse programs. These are the costs of the actual services. Many of these also would fall under public facilities and public improvements if you actually were using CDBG funds to build a building that was going to serve as a healthcare clinic. That would fall under public facilities. But if you're actually using the funds to provide the service, then it's a public service. There are caps on public service activities, and the CDFA may only use up to 15% of their total allocation every year on public service activities, which is why it is not a commonly used activity in the state and small cities program. Payment of the non-federal share is another eligible activity. Many states recently have received disaster funding. Many states have had natural disasters in the last several years, and FEMA has come in and requires a local cost share from the community or from the state. CDBG is the only federal program that can be used as the local cost share on another federal grant program. So this is how we match things like FEMA and NRCS and federal highway when there's a local match required. The key is that you may still only fund CDBG eligible activities, and you must still meet a national objective of the CDBG program. But matching them would fall under this eligible activity versus public improvements. Relocation. Relocation is done when you're running a housing program and you need to temporarily or permanently relocate someone due to your CDBG investment. The cost of relocating that person or persons would fall under the eligible activity of relocation. You may use CDBG, if it's allowable under the state program, to provide relocation expenses when the project that displaced the person was not actually funded with CDBG. This is almost never done, but it is something that is eligible. Planning and capacity building are essentially activities that a local unit of government would do to plan for their long-term future, their capacity, and determine needs and feasibility of certain projects. Examples of planning and capacity building at the local level would be comprehensive plans, individual project plans, like a preliminary engineering report, community development plans, neighborhood plans, housing plans, historic preservation studies and feasibility studies, functional plans. Again, an example might be determining whether or not your community needs a community center, and you might do a feasibility study to determine what activities do we not have in our area, what activities are too far away, what activities do the community want, what would the cost of the building be. Those would be considered a feasibility study or a functional plan. What this category does not include is architectural and engineering and design costs that are related specifically to a project or the cost of implementing the plan. So your planning and capacity building would be your preliminary design and study, and your bid specs and final design would be part of the actual activity that you were carrying out, not planning. Program administration costs. These are the costs that you are given from CDFA to administer your CDBG project or program. They are capped in the state program, and they are capped in the CDFA program, and they must be used for CDBG activities. So they must be part of running your CDBG project or program. Some of those eligible costs would be your staff, citizen participation costs, fair housing activities. Cost of administering home and empowerment zones are actually eligible in the CDBG program, but I have to date not heard of anyone who actually did that. Next, we're going to talk about activities carried out through community development organizations. You'll often hear these referred to as CBDOs, or community-based development organizations. These private or public nonprofit organizations are given a certain latitude within the regulations. The entitlement regulations spell out specifically what entities are allowed to be considered CBDOs. The state program has certain latitude for nonprofit organizations in the non-entitlement areas. Each state will determine who and what they certify as a CBDO. There are certain advantages for becoming and utilizing a CBDO in a state program, one of which is program income. In the CBDO regulations, it does allow for program income to not be considered CDBG when it comes back and is reutilized. The other advantage of a CBDO is the ability to do otherwise ineligible new construction of housing. There are certain circumstances in which you can do this, but it certainly allows for housing and community development organizations to create new housing when necessary. Another advantage of using a CBDO is if a community is doing public services and the state program is doing a lot of public services in their program, there can be exceptions where public services are not subject to the aggregate public services cap. Another advantage is in certain circumstances, activities carried out by a CBDO for economic development purposes are not subject to the aggregate public benefit standards. Energy use strategies and energy efficiency. These are essentially the same duplication of planning activity and public facilities and public improvement, but they are their own eligible activity. If you're doing a plan or some activity that is for energy efficiency, whether it's a local government plan or some type of public sector actions planning, or applying for a grant to replace all of your city lighting with LED lighting. Again, because it's eligible in the CDBG program does not mean that it's currently eligible in the CDFA program. The CDFA program is ruled by their method of distribution that they put out each year. Assistance to for-profit businesses. Assistance to for-profit businesses is when you provide CDBG funding to a for-profit business to do some type of economic development project that's either going to create or retain jobs, prevent or eliminate slum or blight, or meet an urgent need. It could be creating a business that's owned by community residents or providing assistance to businesses that are providing necessary goods and services to an affordable LMI target area or service area. The thing here is those may sound a lot like the national objectives that we talked about on our previous webinar, and that's exactly what they are. In order to provide assistance to a for-profit business, they must meet one of the national objectives, including if it's a business that is providing necessary goods and services to affordable LMI residents. What can that assistance look like? Well, there's really no restriction on what you give the money to the for-profit business for. The for-profit business can use that money as working capital. It might be for specific capital equipment that they need in order to create jobs. It might be for specific capital improvements to eliminate blight and move into a property that's going to be an economic development driver in the community. It can be made in the form of a grant or a loan guarantee. I said earlier when you were watching the webinar on national objectives that the only thing the state may do with their CDBG money is make a grant to a local unit of government. However, the municipality does have the ability to make loans to these for-profit businesses and recoup that payment, principal, and interest, and it becomes program income. What this category of assistance to for-profit businesses does not include, you may not use assistance to for-profit businesses to pay for any type of lobbying or political activities. You cannot use this category to pay for public facilities or improvements that are actually going to be carried out to support a for-profit business. If you're doing a public facility or improvement, even if it's for the benefit of a for-profit business, it would be done under public facilities and improvements, not under this category. New construction of housing, so you cannot provide assistance to a for-profit home builder to create housing because of our new construction of housing ban. You cannot pay for planning for economic development projects. Again, under this specific category, you can pay for planning for economic development under the planning activity. And non-job related training. So if you're doing a job training program and taking anybody in the community who wants to apply to learn how to be a welder, but it's not for a specific job that they will have at the end of the training, then that is under public services, not under assistance to for-profit business. However, you can provide assistance to a for-profit business who needs the money to provide training because they don't have enough workers in your area with the skills necessary, but they are willing to train them if you're willing to pay for it with your CDBG funds. That would be assistance to for-profit business. The other thing to keep in mind, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more here in a few minutes, is that anytime you're doing assistance to for-profit business, there is a concept of public benefit, and we are going to be talking about the thresholds or the limits that you are required to meet when you're providing money to a business. You cannot provide them in excess of a certain dollar amount. Technical assistance is actually providing the state CDFA providing technical assistance to municipalities and nonprofits. The webinar that you're watching today is considered technical assistance. Housing services. Housing services are not subject to the public services cap, and they are services that are provided in conjunction with tenant-based rental assistance under the home program. You can pay for auditing, preparation of work specifications, loan processing, and management. This is not a commonly used CDBG activity because most CDBG grantees are getting home money as well, and so they do not provide funds for this in their method of distribution. Assistance to institutions of higher education. The key here is that there is no flexibility in the eligible activities. You may provide assistance to an institution of higher education. It must still go through a local unit of government, and they can only do eligible activities, and they must meet a national objective. A microenterprise is defined as a commercial enterprise with 5 or fewer employees, one of whom must be the owner. Microenterprise assistance would be providing credit for the microenterprise for creation, expansion, capital equipment. It could be providing technical assistance or business support to the owners of microenterprise, general peer-to-peer counseling, support programs. When you're providing direct assistance, such as a loan or loan guarantees, the national objective of low to moderate income limited clientele is the only national objective that you may use. You must provide that direct assistance to low to moderate income owners. So again, I'm going to repeat that in case I confused you. If you're providing direct assistance, then you meet the national objective of low to moderate income limited clientele only when that microenterprise owner is a low to moderate income person. Otherwise, when you're utilizing the microenterprise assistance eligible activity, you must meet the low to moderate income area benefit or the low to moderate income jobs benefit with microenterprise assistance. Homeownership assistance. Homeownership assistance is providing direct assistance to low to moderate income households to expand homeownership. You can give them down payment. You are limited to 50% of the down payment cost. You can subsidize interest rates and the mortgage principal in order to buy down the cost of the property or the home for them. You can finance acquisition of properties and then resell them to LMI home buyers. And you are allowed to pay reasonable closing costs, which are not defined in the regulations, but are defined by CDFA in their policies and procedures. Lead hazard evaluation and reduction. The cost of evaluating and treating lead-based paint may be undertaken in conjunction with other rehab activities, or it can be a standalone activity. So if you're doing a housing rehab program, owner-occupied rehab program, the cost of doing the required lead hazard assessment and reduction would fall under this eligible activity. Or you might have a program where all you're doing is lead hazard reduction work. Some of the things that you can do are testing blood of children to determine their lead levels, inspecting homes for lead hazards, relocating families while you're doing the lead control work as part of a rehab program, community outreach and education, and you can use CDBG funds for job training to certify lead hazard control workers. So what are these lead hazard activities? Lead hazard evaluation is essentially identifying whether there are lead-based paint and lead hazards in the home, and it defines the types of evaluations and the methods used in CPD regulations as visual assessment, paint testing, and risk assessment. Those are the 3 levels or methods used to determine if there is a lead paint hazard. Lead hazard reduction is essentially minimizing the risk of the lead-based paint. There are 4 methods that you would use for hazard reduction. The regulations discuss them, and they are paint stabilization, interim controls, abatement, and standard treatments. The regulations on lead-based paint activities are very prescriptive and comprehensive, and will discuss the costs associated, and the cost of rehab dictates the level of lead hazard, which is in another section of our webinars and will be talked about later. Now we're going to talk about some specifically ineligible activities. I like to call these activities specially ineligible because anything that is not identified in the Housing and Community Development Act as eligible is considered ineligible. But they went to the effort of saying, and you really can't do these things. These things are new construction of housing. We've talked about this quite a bit already. We've talked about some of the exceptions. You cannot use CDBG funds for the new construction of housing except those in support of activities that I talked about, which are not really housing at all. They're infrastructure, roads, storm sewer, things that you would do to get a property ready or to facilitate housing development. Conversion or substantial rehabilitation. This is, again, not new construction. This is the example of taking a building that's already there and converting it into housing, whether that's minor rehabilitation or substantial rehabilitation. Reconstruction, I talked about this, is not new construction of housing as long as you meet the same requirements in the building on the same property, in the same footprint, and essentially the same number and size of units. It is considered reconstruction and is not ineligible. Last resort housing. This has to do with the Uniform Relocation Act, and I mentioned it before. If you have converted or demolished housing that is affordable and occupiable, and you do not have other housing in the area to replace that with, then you may do new construction. You must go through HUD, and it is not commonly done. And any new housing that's undertaken by that community-based development organization that we talked about before is not considered new housing construction, or I should say it is new housing construction, but there is an exception for new construction of housing when it's done through a community-based development organization. One of the other especially ineligible activities are anything that is for the buildings for the general conduct of government. City halls, county buildings, state capitol, town halls, any facility where the general administrative affairs of the government are conducted are ineligible. You may, however, do removal of architectural barriers. So where this says does not restrict ADA improvements, that goes back to our conversation about there must be something there that is a barrier to access or mobility, and you may remove that barrier. It does not restrict use in special purpose buildings. A building that is specifically for the provision of public services, maybe we call them social service centers or public service centers, where they've grouped together in a building unemployment, WIC, food stamps, other social services where the general public needs to come for the provision of those services. Those special purpose buildings are not considered buildings for the general conduct of government, and you may use CDBG funds on those buildings. General government expenses are also specifically prohibited. You may not use CDBG money to pay for local government municipality staff unless it is directly related to the CDBG project or program, and it must be tracked with a timesheet. Political activities of any kind are specifically ineligible. However, people have asked in the past, we built a community center or a fire station with CDBG. Are we not allowed to have that be a polling place? That is actually okay. They may be used on an incidental basis for political meetings, voter registration, as long as all parties or organizations have access. Income payments are also specifically prohibited in the CDBG program. An income payment is an ongoing benefit that lasts for 3 consecutive months, and those are typically for food or clothing, rent, utilities. Those are things that under the public services slide, we had emergency rent, utility payments. Those are things that you may do with CDBG, but you cannot provide them to the same person or the same household for more than 3 months, or they become an income payment and become specifically ineligible. We've already talked about the operation and maintenance when you're doing public improvements in public facilities being ineligible. Tobacco retailers, Public Law 106-377 came out around 2000 and basically states that with all federal funding that the Department of Housing and Urban Development cannot fund facilities that predominantly sell cigarettes, meaning 35% or more of their total non-fuel sales are coming from the sale of cigarettes. Those facilities, those retailers may not be assisted with CDBG funds. And then activities listed as ineligible under 2 CFR 200. The cost principles in 2 CFR 200 prohibit federal funds from being used on a list of things, but those include things like alcohol and bad debt. For a list of those ineligible activities, you can watch the webinar that includes financial management, or go to 2 CFR 200 on ecfr.gov and look at that list. CDBG may also not be used for religious activities. This means that you cannot fund a property that is used primarily for religious purposes. You may, however, support religious organizations and their buildings if the building is used, or the portion of the building is used wholly for secular purposes. So what do I mean by that? Well, you might have a religious organization in your community that is the only food pantry or provides clothing and emergency rent, you can provide assistance to that portion of the nonprofit religious organization as long as they do not restrict use of their facility or their services to a specific religious organization or sect. For example, the Salvation Army for many, many years was ineligible to use CDBG funds because they required, for meals and for overnight, they required participants to be involved in a religious activity. So they would not be eligible for funding if they were requiring someone to attend a service, receive a religious brochure, or they were restricting the use of that facility to people of their religion. Economic development activities without a sufficient public benefit. So any activity that does promotion of a community as a whole is not eligible. Professional sports teams are specifically ineligible. Privately owned recreational facilities that are for predominantly higher income clientele, such as golf courses, are ineligible. You cannot acquire land with no specific use, such as land banking, and we mentioned that when we talked about acquisition as the eligible activity. You must have a CDBG national objective as a purpose and meet that national objective with the acquisition of land. And you cannot fund a for-profit or an owner who has an unresolved finding of non-compliance. So you may not continue to fund someone who has been given CDBG money and has findings of non-compliance. There are some additional rules in the CDBG program. Multi-use facilities, I've already talked about this a little bit. Facilities that contain both eligible and ineligible uses, as long as you can separate the costs and identify the portion of the building and the costs associated with the eligible portion, then you can fund the portion of the facility that is CDBG eligible. There's a change of use requirement in CDBG, and I mentioned this briefly before. Anytime you use CDBG funds to acquire or improve property that exceeds the small purchase threshold, which is currently set at $250,000, then the municipality may not change the use or the planned use of the property 5 years from closeout unless the new use meets another national objective and public notice has been provided. You must have another public hearing. If you cannot do both of those things, repayment to CDFA will be required. As I mentioned, if you change the use of your CDBG funded facility or property and the new use does not meet a national objective, you may pay back your grant or dispose of the property and reimburse CDFA. You must reimburse them at the current fair market value less any portion that was non-CDBG. So if you used $600,000 of CDBG funds to fund a $1 million community center project, and you decide 4 years out that people are not really taking advantage of the community center and you would like to sell that property or turn it into part of your town hall, then you would have to reimburse the CDBG program at a minimum 60% of the whatever the fair market value is that you receive for that property. Many state programs require full reimbursement of the CDBG funds. You'll want to check with CDFA should that be a potential thing that you're going to have to deal with. So in review of the eligible activities, we've gone over all of the eligible activities. We've gone over all of the ineligible activities. We've discussed the fact that some activities might be eligible under more than one citation. And you typically don't have to worry about that. CDFA will determine which eligible activity it is on their end. Most projects and programs are made up of several eligible activities. So you may be doing a wastewater treatment project where you are required to purchase property or easements for the program. You're required to do public facilities, public improvements, and you may be getting some general administration funds as well. So as you can see, many of the activities do have multiple eligible activities according to the Housing and Community Development Act. And then one of the most important things we discussed was the change of use, that you must maintain the use of your CDBG funded facility for at least 5 years. There are some special requirements as well for the CDBG program. Anti-pirating is the first one. The CDBG funds are not allowed to move jobs from one labor market to another, and we call this anti-pirating. If the jobs that are moving are 0.1% or more than 500 jobs, it is considered pirating and it is specifically ineligible. If it does not meet that threshold, then there are specific things, the documentation that you will have to go through. However, most states have taken the policy that they will not fund relocated jobs with CDBG. They will only fund the new creation of jobs or the retention of jobs in their state. Eminent domain restrictions. HUD prohibits the use of CDBG funds on any project that is using eminent domain for economic development. It's important to note that it is only for economic development. You may use eminent domain on public works, public improvement projects. The regulation is not, or the requirement is not in the regulations. It actually comes out in the HUD appropriation bill every year since 2006. Economic development underwriting guidelines. We talked about assistance to for-profit business, and we talked about what types of funding that you could give them. You could give them grants, you could give them loans. You must, however, meet the underwriting guidelines at a minimum that are found in Appendix A to Part 570, which is where the CDBG regulations are located. Those minimum requirements are making sure that the costs are reasonable, that all of the other sources of financing are committed, that CDBG funds are not being substituted for non-federal support. The project has to be determined to be financially feasible. The owner's return on investment has to be determined to not be unreasonably high, and CDBG funds should be dispersed on a pro rata basis. CDFA has their own underwriting guidelines, and those must be followed by all municipalities in the New Hampshire Community Development Program. You can find those on the CDFA website. Public benefit standards. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about assistance to for-profit business. The statute requires that when CDBG funds are used for economic development, that there is a certain public benefit that's met to ensure that the amount of CDBG assistance being provided is appropriate for the number of jobs that are being created. The grantee is required to do this due diligence assessment prior to application and at the time of closeout. The way that an activity meets the national objective does not have to be the same way that it meets the public benefit test. The public benefit test is met by the number of jobs that are created or the number of LMI people that are receiving a specific and necessary goods and service related to the amount of CDBG funds that have been invested. The individual activity standards. For every project that is creating or retaining jobs, CDBG funds cannot exceed $50,000 per full-time equivalent job, or they cannot exceed $1,000 per low to moderate income person that's being served if you're using the provision of goods and services to meet the public benefit standard. Let me give you an example. You're funding a for-profit grocery store in a low to moderate income area who is creating 10 jobs. You cannot provide more than $500,000 in CDBG assistance for the creation of those 10 jobs. If the area that's being served has 100,000 people in it, 60,000 of those people are low to moderate income, then you can provide up to $600,000 if you use the provision of goods and services. The key is that when you're counting jobs, you count all jobs created, not the number of jobs that are taken by low to moderate income people. And when you're counting necessary goods and services low to moderate income people served, you only count the low to moderate income people served. This is how it's different than the national objective. The national objective, if you create 10 jobs and 6 of them must be low to moderate income, but you count 10 jobs times 50,000 at a maximum to determine the public benefit standard. If you have 100,000 people in your service area, 51% of them must be low to moderate income if you're meeting the national objective that way. But if you're using it for public benefit, then you only count the ones that are LMI times 1,000 to get your public benefit standard. The aggregate standard says that for all projects that you've done within the year, all economic development projects that are funded by CDFA within the year have to be aggregated. And the total amount per job for all of those activities cannot exceed $35,000. And if they're using the public benefit standard of necessary goods and services, the aggregate standard cannot exceed $350 per low to moderate income person. This is why most states take the policy that they will not allow more than $35,000 per job at the outset for every project that's funded with CDBG, because they don't know what other projects will happen through the course of the year, and they must meet that $35,000 aggregate standard at the end of the year on all projects that are funded for all municipalities. The final thing that we're going to talk about is community revitalization strategy areas. Communities with an approved revitalization strategy area have enhanced flexibility. These community revitalization strategy areas essentially have the same benefits that we talked about with a CBDO. Job creation and retention activities can be classified as meeting low to moderate income without doing income verification. Grantees are permitted to track scattered site housing in accordance with a single structure. Economic development activities that are carried out in that particular strategy area are exempt from the aggregate public benefit standards that I just discussed. And all public services that are offered within the CRSA is also exempt from the public services cap. That is it for today for our eligible activities in the CDBG program. If you should have any questions about anything that we talked about on this webinar, please contact CDFA at the information on the slide that you see. Thank you again for your attendance.